sobriety testing. Now we're going to move our attention to chemical testing for alcohol and drugs. So in Ohio, we have per se cases, and if you're really new to this, that just means it is per se illegal to operate a vehicle with a prohibited concentration of alcohol or drugs in your breath, blood, or urine. And so because we have those prohibited concentrations, that means law enforcement has to have some way to measure alcohol and drugs in blood, breath, and urine. But those test results can be used not only in those per se cases, but also in cases of OVI impaired, where the prosecution simply has to prove the person's ability to operate the vehicle is impaired by alcohol and/or drugs of abuse. I suppose the most accurate way to measure a drug would be to take some brain tissue and measure that, but I think even our prosecutor friends wouldn't recommend that kind of method. And I kid prosecutors, by the way, but I have several friends who are prosecutors, and hopefully they would find my jokes funny, even if no one else does. So since we don't test brain tissue, what we do in Ohio is we test blood, urine, and breath. And the methods for testing blood and urine are essentially the same, so we're going to talk about those two together. Now, the way blood and urine is tested depends whether the test is done by a healthcare provider, which typically means a hospital, or someone other than a healthcare provider, which typically means a crime lab. Now, the test you see in the screen you may recognize is a pregnancy test. And I'm not sure if that young woman is overcome with joy or sorrow, but her test seems to be positive, and you can tell that by the red strip. Well, how does that red strip get there? This test is called an immunoassay test. As you may know, the human body has antibodies in it. And those antibodies will essentially attack an antigen that's introduced into the body to neutralize it. But when we're looking for a particular substance in a person's urine or blood, we'll say urine in this case, and let's say we're looking for THC. Well, the THC would be considered an analyte. And so the immunoassay in this example would use an antibody that is known to attack or known to bind with this particular antigen, THC. And when the test strip is created, and that's what is inside of what you're looking at, there's a test strip in there. And if you can imagine taking that test strip and dipping it in a sample of urine, well, if there is THC in there, these antibodies will bind with the THC, and that will produce a chemical reaction, and the chemical reaction will produce that color, like in this case it's a red color, on the test strip. And there are some that can actually quantify, give a number to the presence or amount of THC or other drug based on the intensity of the reaction between the antibodies and the analytes. But most of what we see just confirm the presence of the analyte. So that is at a hospital, but what we want to talk about now is blood and urine testing at crime laboratories. And what you see in the graphic there is a gas chromatograph. And chromatography is a science testing method that is used to separate the components of a mixture. You know, blood is a mixture, urine is a mixture. It has many different components in it. And it may have some of those components may include substances which impair a person's ability to drive. So let's take a look at the diagram. If you look at the top left, there's what appears to be, looks like a syringe or a plunger. So imagine that syringe or plunger has a blood or urine sample in it. Let's just use a blood sample. So what happens is once the blood sample is withdrawn from the suspect, it's put into a vial, and then a few drops are taken out of there, put into another container. That container is heated up so that above the blood there would be some gas here, and ultimately those come to equilibrium, and the gas will contain essentially the same components as the liquid blood below it. So that gas is taken, put into this syringe, and then also in that syringe is a carrier gas like helium. And so then that is injected below what looks like the syringe is called an injector port. So the sample is injected into there. Now this is a gas chromatograph, so we're talking about a carrier gas, which is pushing it through the machine. But there's also liquid chromatography where, as you guessed it, it's a liquid instead of a gas, but very similar concepts at least. So what happens is when the sample goes through this machine, you see the round part there, if you look closely, it's called a column. The sample goes through the column and then comes out on what's our right side, and you can see that looks like a little flame, blue flame there. That's a detector. And this one there are different types of detectors. This one is a flame ionization detector. So here's what makes it work. It's this stationary phase, which I label as a distraction, because different components are distracted to different extents by what is composing the stationary phase. So this column is actually a copper tube that's wired around a few times like this before it goes out to the detector. And the column is packed, and the packed column, the packing inside it, that's the stationary phase. Why they call it a stationary phase, I'm not sure, but just think of it as the packing in the column. And so different substances will have different affinities to the chemicals that are in the packing. One way to kind of visualize it is if I go to Polaris Mall with my wife and my daughter, I'm going to have different affinities to the mall than my wife and daughter are, because there aren't many stores in the mall that get my attention. And so if you were to time us going through the mall, I would certainly come out, or as they use the term, elute. I would elute or exit from the mall very quickly. Now, my wife would be more interested in some things in the mall, so it would take her a little more time. My daughter would be very interested, and she would come out much later. So the time that it takes us to go through the mall, or in a chromatograph, the time it takes a substance to go through the column and elute is called the retention time. So substances, over the years, they have developed databases of retention times for certain substances with certain stationary phases inside these columns. As you can imagine, it's taken a lot of experimentation, but they've done it. And look at that guy. He must be a scientist because he's got on a lab coat. That was actually me working on a column in a chromatograph. And that's another course you can take if you get really into this stuff is Axion Labs up in Chicago. You can go up there and take a 3-day course all about chromatography. Anyway, back to how this works. So because they have known retention times, let's say, for example, it has 1.72 seconds. Let's say ethanol has a known retention time of 1.72 seconds with this particular stationary phase. So we'll put our blood sample in there, or the gas from the blood sample, and push it through, goes through the column and elutes. Anything that comes out at 1.72 seconds is going to be considered ethanol. And that data from the detector is going to be sent to a computer, and the computer is going to create a drawing, or a graphic, I would say, which is called a chromatogram. And it's going to have a peak, and it's going to look like, kind of like that. And based on the area underneath that, it can calculate the concentration or the amount actually of, in this case, ethanol that was in that substance. And so you don't get confused about the chromatograph and the chromatogram. Think of telegraph and telegram. Telegraph is the machine, chromatograph is the machine. And telegram is basically the paper, and chromatogram is the paper when it's printed. So that's for alcohol and drugs in urine and blood. Now let's talk about breath testing. Of course, breath testing, unlike blood and urine testing, only tests for alcohol. So this diagram here is meant to illustrate Henry's law. Really, to make the diagram better, there should be lids on top of the glass jars, because Henry's law says essentially, in a closed system, if you have constant pressure, constant temperature, then there will be a ratio between components in the liquid and components in the gas above the liquid. And so why is that important to breath testing? We have basically a ratio, a known ratio for ethanol, and that is, it's very hotly debated, but in forensic science and in the machines that are used for breath testing, it's considered to be 2100 to 1. And so that means for every 2100 molecules of ethanol in a person's blood, there will be 1 molecule of ethanol in the person's breath. And so blood, if you're writing out or looking at a test result, you'll see blood will report ethanol at a certain number of grams per 100 milliliters. But with breath, because of this ratio of 2100 to 1, you'll see the evidence ticket from a breath testing machine will have it in terms of grams of alcohol per 210 liters of breath. Now, of course, the person isn't blowing 210 liters. That'd be like, what, 105 2-liter bottles. The sample isn't that big. That'd be a long breath. Keep blowing, keep blowing, keep blowing. But it's because of that partition ratio. That's why you see it listed as 210 liters of breath. So once they're blowing into the breath testing machine, this is essentially what it looks like if you were to strip away everything else. Up on the top right, you see where it says breath alcohol in. So that would be a breath tube going into the breath testing machine. Of course, they'd first get a new mouthpiece and put that on the breath tube. Once the breath is going into the tube, it goes into this green horizontal part there called the sample chamber. On the left side of the sample chamber in red is an infrared energy source. You can think of it as infrared light. Technically, it's energy. And anyway, the amount of energy in that infrared source is known. And so it's emitting infrared energy at certain wavelengths. And that is going to the right. And over on the right is the infrared detector. So because the amount of energy in the infrared source is known, as the breath sample is going through the sample chamber, we would expect that the exact amount of energy being produced by the infrared source would be detected by the detector, unless there's something which absorbs some of that energy. And this is called infrared spectrometry. So and the reason it's important is we know that ethanol absorbs infrared energy at certain wavelengths. And so the detector will actually detect how much of the beginning infrared energy is missing. And so however much is missing, they're going to attribute to being absorbed by ethanol. That information is going to be sent from the detector to a microprocessor, and then the microprocessor is going to do the breath alcohol calculation, and then it's going to print out a ticket which tells us how many grams per 210 liters of breath were in that person's breath sample. And if you can just memorize this formula that's on the chalkboard here, then you'll be able to do your own analysis of breath samples for the concentration of alcohol. I don't even know what that formula is for. I don't even understand the first line. Okay, so we've talked about chemical testing, both by healthcare providers and by crime labs. And we've talked about that in terms of breath testing and blood and urine testing. So now that you're an expert, or at least you have the basics of that science, you need to know the Ohio law on chemical testing for OVI. For healthcare providers, that's in Revised Code 4511.19 D1A. And what you need to know are a few things about this. Number one, if the testing is done by a hospital or other healthcare provider, it can't be used in per se cases. It can only be used in impaired OVI cases. And if the prosecution wants to use a test result from a healthcare provider in an impaired case, the prosecutor is going to need to introduce expert testimony to correlate the test result, the number, with the impact on a person's ability to drive. I think they're also going to need to correlate that with the time of operation, because typically, the test is done, could be half an hour later, could be a couple hours later, even more. So they would have to do what's called retrograde extrapolation to relate that test result to the time that the vehicle was operated. So those are the downsides for the prosecutor. The upside for the prosecutor for results from healthcare providers is those kinds of tests do not need to comply with Ohio Department of Health regulations. So now let's talk about everything other than healthcare providers, which means crime labs and police stations doing the breath testing. So they also have a subsection of 4511.19, and this one is D1B. This one has some more requirements. So if the test is done by someone other than a healthcare provider, first of all, the test has to be done within 3 hours of, actually the test doesn't have to be done. The sample has to be withdrawn, whether that's a breath, blood, or urine sample, has to be withdrawn within 3 hours of operation of the vehicle. It has to be withdrawn, well, at least for blood and urine, they have to be done pursuant to a warrant or consent. Technically, breath can be done as a search incident to arrest, so it doesn't have to be pursuant to a warrant. And so either of them can be done pursuant to consent. Sorry about that, I just had some interference on my screen. This revised code section tells us who may withdraw blood, and that is essentially physicians, nurses, phlebotomists, EMTs, and some other specifically named healthcare providers. Whoever analyzes the test sample has to have a permit by the Ohio Department of Health. And the test has to be done in accordance with methods approved by the Ohio Department of Health. Now, those methods approved by the Ohio Department of Health are in the Ohio Department of Health regulations in Chapter 3701.53. So let's talk about the Ohio Department of Health regulations. For blood, again, the regulations say who may withdraw the blood, the same as what's in the statute. But regarding the blood draw, it also says what type of antiseptic must be used, and it's a non-volatile antiseptic. They don't want alcohol to be used in it. The needle must be a dry, sterile needle, and the container must be a glass vacuum container, and whoever does the withdrawing of the sample must add a solid anticoagulant to the sample so it doesn't coagulate. With urine, really the only specific regulation for that collection is that it has to be witnessed, and also that it has to be a glass screw top container. Now, these regulations apply to both blood and urine. So either type of sample has to be sealed in a way that there can't be tampering, or that tampering can be detected, and excuse me, has to be labeled with the name or initials of the person who took the sample, the name of the subject, the date, and the time. And when that sample is not in transit to the crime lab or being tested at the crime lab, it has to be kept under refrigeration. And the crime lab needs to keep and document a chain of custody for the sample. The regulations say that only approved methods can be used, and they actually list what testing methods are approved. And so we talked earlier about immunoassays. Well, those can be used, but they're only used for presumptive tests, not confirmation tests, and not quantifying the amount of the substance in the sample. For that, they'll use gas chromatography or liquid chromatography, and whatever testing method is used for the presumptive test, the second test, the confirmation test, has to be a different method. Whatever instrument is used for the testing has to be calibrated each day that they do testing, and they have to have a procedure manual that tells them how to do each type of test. That manual has to be kept in the area where the testing is done. The manual has to be signed by the lab director, and it has to be updated. And updates have to be recorded in the manual. I've just run into this problem recently in a vehicular homicide case where it wasn't signed by a lab director. There were no updates in it. I think that's going to be a problem for the prosecution. The regulations say they also have to retain records for the prescribed period, which is 3 years. I've seen that be a problem before. The lab has to do proficiency testing. They have to successfully complete a national proficiency testing program. That has been a problem as well. And finally, each of the individuals that participate in the testing of the sample have to have a permit issued by the Ohio Department of Health. And again, in my recent case, we just ran into that because the testing was done at NMS Labs over in Pennsylvania, and some people there have permits from the Ohio Department of Health and some don't. So now we're going to talk about the regulations for breath testing. Breath testing is, of course, different because it only tests for alcohol, and also because the instruments are being used by police agencies rather than a crime lab. So they have their own set of regulations. Well, first, the instrument being used has to be approved by the Ohio Department of Health. Of course, the Ohio Department of Health, in its infinite wisdom, approved this thing, the Intoxilyzer 8000, which has turned out to be not the most reliable. But nevertheless, it is approved. The other machines in Ohio which are approved are the Intoxilyzer 5000 and the Datamaster machines. Like blood and urine testing, records for the breath test and the breath testing machine and all of its maintenance and such have to be kept for 3 years. Now this one's pretty easy. The officer, the operator as they call them, has to follow an operational checklist or an instrument display. That's pretty easy to do. It's also pretty easy to write your results on the forms prescribed by the Ohio Department of Health. But one thing that they do have problems with sometimes is the weekly instrument check and RFI check. So the instrument check is designed to make sure the machine's functioning properly. And so what they do is they take a glass jar, fill it with a solution that contains a known concentration of alcohol. We'll say in this case it's a 0.100. They'll heat it up, Henry's law again, so that the gas above there has the concentration of 0.100, and then they'll inject that into the machine because it's simulating human breath, and the machine should get the result of 0.100. Now, the test result for that weekly instrument check is considered passing if it is within 5/1000ths of the target value, which in this case was a 0.100. So a 0.095 to a 0.105 would be considered a valid test result or instrument check result. If the result is outside that 5/1000ths, then they have to do a second test. And if the second test is still outside the 5/1000ths, then the machine has to be sent out for service. And when a machine comes back from service, they have to do another instrument check. And also if a new machine is placed in service, they have to do an instrument check at that time as well. And they also have to use that instrument check solution that I talked about, but they can't just make their own home brew. It has to be an instrument check solution which has been approved by the Ohio Department of Health, and it can't be expired. And the instrument check solution expires 1 year after the date of its manufacture. Once a bottle of the solution is opened, even if it's still within that 1 year, the bottle, once it's opened, can only be used for 90 days. So there's another type of expiration date, if you will. When the solution is not being used for testing, it has to be refrigerated, and the bottle has to be retained during that 90-day period. And finally, the operator, the person administering the breath test, has to have a permit from the Ohio Department of Health, and the senior operator, the person doing the weekly instrument check, also has to have a senior operator permit from the Ohio Department of Health. I think I skipped the RFI check. I'm sorry about that. The RFI check is done in conjunction with the weekly instrument check. And RFI is radio frequency interference. And they check this because it's known that radio frequencies, devices that emit radio frequencies, like a walkie-talkie that police use, or like a cell phone that everyone uses, that will interfere with the proper functioning of the breath testing machine. And so they have an RFI detector in the machine that should abort the test if radio frequency interference is detected. And so they have to check that every week when they do the weekly instrument check. So when you get a case which involves a breath test, you want to look through the law enforcement agency's records, which of course we know they have to keep for 3 years, to see if they can prove compliance with all of these regulations. The same is true when you get a case that involves a blood or urine test. Of course, instead of getting the records from the law enforcement agency, you should ask for them from the prosecutor. And most labs will have what they call a standard discovery packet. They'll send that to you, and you'll be able to check all of those regulations to see if there has been compliance with the regulations. I think we skipped one. No, we didn't. Yeah, that kind of leads into the issue of challenging test admissibility. This is a little bit beyond the scope of, the science of DUI, but if you're going to use that, most likely you're going to use it first by challenging the result, admissibility, either breath test, blood test, or urine test. You're going to file a motion to suppress that test result. And in fact, that first case that's mentioned there in the first bullet point is State versus French. And State versus French tells us if you want to challenge the admissibility of a chemical test, you have to file a motion to suppress. And then Criminal Rule 47 tells us that motion to suppress has to be somewhat particularized, and which has been interpreted by the next cases, Schindler and Guadalupe, which tell us in more detail what exactly does particularized mean? How particular does it need to be? Once you filed that motion to suppress, then the judge is going to schedule a motion hearing. And at the motion hearing, then the burden shifts to the prosecutor. Now the prosecutor has to prove that the test and everything underlying it has substantially complied with all of those Ohio Department of Health regulations. And what State versus Burnside tells us, remember we talked about that with regard to what is substantial compliance, it also tells us that whether the test reliability is affected by the noncompliance is irrelevant. The judge isn't supposed to consider the reliability of the test. They leave that to the Ohio Department of Health to determine those issues. Instead, the judge just has to determine, did the law enforcement agency or the crime lab or a combination of them or the nurse, whoever it is that's named in the regulations and in your motion to suppress, did they substantially comply with the regulations or not? That's the test. And that is the basics of DUI science. So if you're going to practice OVI defense, then you're going to need to understand the basics of DUI science. Obviously, we covered a lot in an hour. There's a lot to learn, but I think that's something that makes this area of law really interesting and fun to practice. I've been doing this for 24 years, and I still legitimately like what I do. I know a lot of attorneys don't, but I think that's because I've chosen an area of law that it really is fascinating. And so, as I mentioned earlier, if you get into this stuff, there are more courses you can take to learn more about chemical testing and to learn more about field sobriety testing. And so I encourage you to take a look at those. In the meantime, I hope that what we've covered in the last hour, I hope this presentation and the written paper that I've provided have been good resources for you, with regard to the basics of DUI science. And now, if there's any time, I'd be glad to answer any questions.